I am curious to know what happened. I'm going to say his name wrongly, but even as I say it wrongly, it still makes me sound smarter. JeanJacques Rousseau.
Yeah.
What you intentionally pick up there, and so it seems like something happened either with that man or during that era that brought a shift that was significant enough to start there. So would you mind maybe like letting us peer into that just a little bit more, because I'd be interested on that point.
Yes, well, Rousseau is an interesting figure, a 18th century philosopher out of Geneva. A remarkable man. I mean, a genius. He's self-taught. He's a composer. He's a high-flying civil servant. He comes from a very humble background. He's a philosopher. He's a novelist. You name it, Rousseau kind of had his finger in it somewhere. I think he captures a certain cultural moment quite brilliantly in his thinking, in that the Reformation's happened, the authority of the church is shattered. The questions about, what does life mean? Where is certainty to be found? These are the things that are bubbling up in what we call the Enlightenment. And Rousseau is the man who realizes that reason, rational thought, isn't really enough to fully explain what it means to be a human being. That actually our sympathy, our empathy, our emotions, they're very important in what it means to be a human being. And I would agree with him on that. I mean, I think Rousseau has an admirably sophisticated understanding of what it means to be a human being. His real where he sort of gets controversial, however, is in his basic idea that it's actually society that screws you up. If we were left in a state of nature, we'd be okay. We wouldn't envy people. We wouldn't be jealous. There wouldn't be petty rivalries or ambitions. Everybody would just be perfectly attuned. And guess what? Everybody would be able to be outwardly that which they feel themselves to be inwardly. They would be able to be authentic. And when you think of how the notion of authenticity is so important in modern culture. Think of Bruce Jenner coming out as Caitlyn Jenner, and the kind of language he used in that interview with Diane Sawyer about, I was living a lie, now I'm free to be the real me. This is the language of authenticity. And this is language that really finds its roots in the social thinking, the social philosophy, the social psychology that Rousseau is developing in the 18th century. And Rousseau is really the man who is an inspiration to the Romantics, the great, particularly Percy Bysshe Shelley. And the Romantics are important because they take this importance of the inner life and of emotions, and they express it in an artistic form. And that's how to communicate elite ideas to others in society. Art, music, novels, these kind of things. That's the way these ideas make their way out into the population in general. So Rousseau and the Romantics, central figures in the development of the Western notion of selfhood.
Yeah, no, that's significant. That's because that's bumps almost right up against the Enlightenment in a lot of ways, and it seems like Romanticism is kind of a reaction to the arrogance of the Enlightenment, and then you have this ethic of what you feel is true, right? And so like that is our ethic today. Like that's what we use all the time, and so it's wild to think that like hundreds of years ago it started then, and we've just put a scaffolding around it since then to kind of reinforce and justify it.
Yeah, well. The real issue is, of course, the French Revolution. The French Revolution was meant to be the triumph of reason. It ends up as a bloodbath. And you have these European intellectuals wrestling with, okay, now that religion's gone, how do we make human beings decent? That's an English word, of course. Decency is an English concept. How do we make them civilized? How do we make it that they can get on with it, that they're good people? How do we do that? Well, the answer is we have to attune their sentiments correctly so they empathize with others. And Rousseau, this is where Rousseau's thinking gets picked up. You have Friedrich Schiller, the German playwright and poet, arguing that art is what does that. It's the production of art that most unifies human beings, that we're divided against ourselves. Our reason and our emotions are always in conflict, but art can bring them together in harmony and make us good people. What, of course, the Romantics had that we don't have is they had this great confidence that there was such a thing as human nature, that it had a moral structure, and that therefore that would that would give our empathy a natural shape. What we lack today, of course, we've got their aesthetics, or we've got all the stuff about feelings, but those feelings are now detached from any notion that there is any kind of morally authoritative or morally shaped human nature to regulate and stabilize those things. So we have anarchic chaos. If Oprah Winfrey thinks it's right in her heart, it must be right in her heart. If I look at that terminally ill person and it breaks my heart that they can't just take their own lives, then surely it's right for them to take their own lives. We have no broader moral framework rooted in a notion of human nature that allows us to control our ethics relative to the aesthetics of sentiment.
So you see Rousseau's work as, in a lot of ways, the initial seed that brings us all the way up to postmodernism. Would that be accurate to say?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a great man theorist of history, so I never want to say it's one person. But I would say in terms of the development of the way European intellectuals thought about these issues, Rousseau is one of the signally important figures. Obviously, his thinking needs to be picked up by the Romantics, that there are stages along the way to getting to where we are today. But I would say Rousseau is extremely important. If you've ever thought, well, you ever heard the argument, well, society screwed that person up, in which there's often a fair amount of truth in particular examples, but that's a Rousseau argument. Rousseau's the man who really first sort of makes that in a powerful way, that we are made good, and it is society and culture that makes us inauthentic.
No, that's helpful. That being coupled into those three areas of examination that you traced out for us earlier on, because when it comes to sexual identity, it's almost the entirety of how we conceive of being human. Like most of us don't value family. So like the idea of fatherhood or sonship or whatever, like those aren't like primary aspects of our identity. What really matters ends up being like sexual preference and sexual pleasure. And so it's really helpful to have that inception piece that brings us all the way up to today, because today it is, as you said, it is the water that we swim in. And it's helpful for me because it's hard for me to even acknowledge that apart from wrestling with the ideas that you're putting forward.
Yeah, and of course, in focusing on the sexual aspect of this, it's useful to remind ourselves, very few people have read Rousseau, very few people have read Freud, very few people today read the early Frankfurt School critical theorists who are developing this stuff, but a lot of people look at pornography. A lot of people look at soap operas and sitcoms. A lot of people look at things that preach this gospel of your life is about sexual fulfillment in the here and now. And sex is purely recreational. It comes with no cost. You can have hookup after hookup and walk away and feel no burden as a result thereof. Those ideas, you don't have to be reading critical theorists to be getting those ideas. You just have to be watching The Young and the Restless or Days of Our Lives or whatever it is. Even some of the commercials sort of preach that. So these ideas have really come down from the elite to being, as you put it, so the air that we breathe, the smell of the shirt that we wear.
Yeah, no, that's helpful because it's not just in the Ivy Leagues. Like these are, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body is a statement that families are wrestling through, right? Like those are conversations that neighbors are having, and so from top to bottom, like and everything in between, it is it's pervasive. It's something that's it's very pertinent. It's very emotionally charged right now when it comes to people's dissonance, but also relationships. Yeah,
and it permeates Christianity, or at least Christianity by the name. The recent Ligonier research into what evangelicals believe. Well, first of all, 30% of evangelicals don't believe Jesus is God, which raises immediate questions about how you're using the word evangelical. That sounds like a sociological term at that point to me. But 20% think gender is a matter of personal choice. 20% of those who would in some way identify with the visible church think that gender is a matter of personal choice. That shows how deeply these ideas have come to use Charles Taylor's term, have come to inhabit the social imaginary. These people aren't believing these things because they've grasped Nietzsche and they've grasped the anti-metaphysics that you need to hold to. It's just the way they intuitively think about the world. Because, hey, if Dave thinks he's really Davina trapped in a man's body, who am I to argue? I don't want to upset Dave. I don't want to oppress him or make him feel marginalized. It's my job to affirm him in his inner feelings, as long as nobody else is getting hurt.
Yeah.